Hi, today's video is about the book A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, written by Winston Churchill. These 4 volumes used to be on the shelf of the home where I grew up, and as a teenager they were always kind of intimidating to me, and I set out the goal to read these 4 volumes, and finally here I am decades later finally finishing that project. Winston Churchill's name is known by most English-speaking people as one of the significant figure in the early 1900s. Certainly one of the most famous British politicians, but as with a lot of names in the social consciousness, we know the name and we don't know much about the person behind the name. I wanted to learn more about who was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill spends decades advancing in the British political system until he becomes Prime Minister. As an author, he wrote an autobiography. He wrote a biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, who was the Duke of Marlborough. He also wrote a history of World War II, and he wrote this book, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. So there's 4 volumes: The Birth of Britain, The New World, The Age of Revolution, and The Great Democracies. So in the first book, The Birth of Britain, he starts in the preface with the Stone Age. And I want to note that all the prefaces to each volume are very, very good. In this one, he makes a point of saying that he's not a professional historian. He's just a reader of history. He studied history, and these are events that he thinks are important. Now, there is a chronology that matches the actual chronology, but by saying that, he's excused from omitting things and concentrating on some things over other things. So it's unfair to expect this to be an authoritative history of the English-speaking peoples. Certainly, most of it is accurate in a general sense of a person who studies history at that time. You know, I had expectations going into this. When he makes those remarks, you kind of have to drop a little bit of your expectations. You know, it's his show. He's writing it the way he wants to write. If he's not interested in it, he's going to leave that out. One thing I like about the title, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, is that, you know, in our current social consciousness, we're very aware of race. And so I found it very refreshing to look at people in terms of language and the language they speak, not so much as race. So there are many races that speak English, and it's our language that unites us. So there's a massive amount of material for this, and all of this material, you can read it all on Wikipedia, you can read professional historians. The important thing here is that this is Winston Churchill's view. He's a politician. He was a critical participant in leading the Allies to the victory in World War II. We're getting an idea of this man's window into history during his time. You can't expect it to meet all these other obligations. So Churchill primarily was a great politician for his longevity in British politics. He was also known as an author and having great prose. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. The first book here, The Birth of Britain, was published 1956. So The Birth of Britain, after the preface where he starts at the Stone Age, he gets into Caesar's occupation of Britannia, and from the very beginning he starts talking about the battles, and he has a chapter on the longbow, and this weapon that was very instrumental in many British victories of this time. It was technologically advanced, it was very sophisticated, and it gave the Britons an advantage over many of their foes. By starting talking about weapons, he sets a pattern that he's going to continue through all 4 volumes. He always talks about battles. There's a consistent rhythm of battle after battle after battle through all these decades and all these centuries. So you really I'm not interested in battles. I would never pick up a book on battles. But Winston Churchill is. And Winston Churchill, it's good that he knew about battles, because I'm sure that knowledge had a lot of value when he was fighting World War II. And with his emphasis on battles, it almost seems like a glorification of war. From a politician's view, a politician is responsible for maintaining the national borders. It does make sense. Along with the battles, he mentions the generals that go with the battles. Now, for me, the names of generals are not very important, because they're usually forgotten a generation after the battle's done. I'm more interested in the history of ideas. I also think that when people were writing history during the early 1900s, this is 1958, battles were of higher importance, because I believe that, students had to memorize the dates of battles and the names of battles. And I don't think that's so important now. I think battles are more a specialized part of history. So Churchill, being a politician, speaking in front of people all the time, he does have kind of an institutional voice. I'm speaking for Great Britain. He kind of has an ex cathedra voice. There's not really much humor here. There's not much charm. He's very steely, he's austere, he's practical, he gets to the point, and then he moves on. He's a very direct style of writing. He's a very good, solid writer. But when I think of another writer of this time, George Orwell, I'm very fond of George Orwell's books. But, this book, it's instructional. And like I said, I learned his view of the world, but I'm not that fond of it. Churchill's pattern is also to concentrate on the power. Who has the power, what they're doing with the power, who threatens the power. He weakly acknowledges the abuses of power, which kind of bothered me. But if you think back in monarchies, there was a concept that the king was appointed by God. And so he has this kind of a British mentality of respecting the royal authority. Even in these early kings, if you criticize the king, you could be punished just for criticizing the monarchy. Now, he brings up various disputes between the peasants and the monarchy. He doesn't seem to have much sympathy for the peasants, when they riot. He kind of acknowledges their grievances, but the fact that they would take up arms and attack the king or attack the royal soldiers, that was just outrageous, and that deserved punishment, execution by any peasant leader. The first volume ends with the Plantagenets and the Wars of the Roses. The second volume, the New World, begins at the year 1600, and immediately he goes into the separation from Britain and the Roman Catholic Church. And this is just a whole labyrinth of complexities. He also talks about the rules of succession for the kings, and it was something I was interested in. It became such a very big deal during the 1700s, how the succession from one king would go to the next, and it caused an enormous amount of problems. It's just a ridiculous system. I'm so grateful that we have presidents of the United States. I wanted to learn more about it, but after reading it, it takes a lot of study, and it's probably not worth your time to figure out exactly how these decisions were made about royal succession. The Crown of Scotland joins England, but at the same time there's a bifurcation of the English-speaking peoples when the Mayflower sails for the New World. So the era of Charles I is really a disgraceful account of poorly governed nation. Churchill doesn't have many quotes, but he does, and sometimes he doesn't choose very good quotes. And here's an example between when he's talking about Charles I and the Parliament. Charles closed down the Parliament. The Parliament did not meet for 11 years. So he inserts this quote, "One party desired Parliament not without the king, and the other the king not without Parliament." I mean, that's a horrible sentence. I'm not an expert in grammar, but these double negatives just confuses me. I was delighted when they executed Charles I. Winston Churchill introduces the two parties, the Whigs and the Tories, another thing that I wanted to know more about. At the beginning, I kind of felt like I knew what the differences were, but then later on, they changed focus a little bit, and I got very confused about the difference between the two parties, and I wish that he kind of summarized the difference clearly between the two parties, because it remained mysterious to me. You know, he could have had like a potent summary or a potent epigram to describe the difference. Okay, the third volume is The Age of Revolution. Churchill goes into the American War of Independence. Now, I would have thought he would have taken the British side, but he was very objective, and he got into the once again all the battles of the War of Independence, the major battles, maps of the battles, the generals involved. Of course, he did the presidents on both sides, but he spent a significant amount of time on the American War of Independence. Then back to the continent, Napoleon takes the stage, and more battles of Napoleon. He notes the generals, he notes the battlefields, the weapons, the maneuvers, the victories. If you like battles, you know, you're going to salivate when you read about the Battle of Wagram, where there were 400,000 participants and 40,000 people died. Then he moves on to the British occupation of India, and I wanted to know his view on British imperialism. Certainly Britain's considered an imperialist nation at this time. He addresses that. So of course the British expansion into India was related to the East India Company in India. So here's a quote. The East India Company was a trading organization. Its directors were men of business. They wanted dividends, not wars, and they grudged every penny spent on troops and annexations. But the turmoil on the great subcontinent compelled them, against their will and their judgment, to take control of more and more territory, till in the end, and almost by accident, they established an empire no less solid and certainly more peaceful than that of the mongrel predecessors. To call this imperialist expansion is nonsense, if by that is meant deliberate acquisition of political power. Then he returns to the continent, and he goes over Wellington's victory over Napoleon. Once again, many things about the battle and the strategies and the generals. The book ends with the War of 1812 in America, and I really enjoyed learning a little bit about the origins of Canada, which was something that was completely left out of my American education. They're really, as a side note, I want to mention that the volumes, they're really, I really like the way it's laid out in this book. The book is published by Dodd, Mead and Company. I really like the typeface, the fonts. It's just a pleasure to read these books. The top, the bottom, the left and the right. It's really a wonderfully put together book. I wish all books could be done like this, because it's probably more expensive because they did such a great job. You know, the spacing of the lines, the spacing of the characters. It's really a pleasure to read this book. They have drawings of the royal lineage. They're all clear, and they add to every volume. And so the fourth volume is The Great Democracies. So we're back to imperialism, and Churchill writes, Britain began to occupy and develop many vacant portions of the globe. So he just kind of sees the globe as vacant. You know, this kind of sounds imperialistic. You know, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, they all had native inhabitants. Here is Britain coming in with British culture, British religion, British architecture, you know, British capitalism. He's kind of like, we're doing you a favor by taking over your country. You know, can we get a little thanks here? But this is the mindset of a Christian conqueror. This is the way they thought. Then he moves on to the Crimean War, and that filled a gap in my knowledge. Once again, more battles. So then he moves on to the American Civil War, and he spent a significant amount of time on this. He's very direct, to the point. And once again, he talks about the Whigs and the Tories. And then he adds in the liberals, the royalists, the Gladstones, the Disraelis. I can remember specific things that they did, but I was left unsatisfied when I wanted to know the mission of each party. So then he goes into the churches also, the Church of England, the Low Church, the High Church, the Methodist, the Baptist, the Presbyterian, the Congregational, the Unitarian, and the Roman Catholic churches. Wow, that's very difficult to be a politician to oversee all those things. He brags a little about the New Zealand and how the native Maori down there, the population was declining, and there was a Native Land Act of the 1860s. The Maori population increased from 37,000 in 1871 to 100,000 in 1951. So he even though he's kind of bragging about that, I do feel like that's not the final word. I want to hear another opinion about that. You know, I'm criticizing him a little bit, but I want to note that for a politician to write a history of the English-speaking peoples, it just puts him in an elite group of politicians. The only one I can think of is Julius Caesar wrote a book about the civil wars, the Roman civil wars. You know, when I think of all the American presidents, they usually write a memoir or they write an autobiography. But I'm not going to research this, but there's never been an American president who wrote a history of the United States of America. So that Winston Churchill did this, that puts him in a very top tier group of politicians. You know, he really cared. He wanted to know what was going on. He did his homework. So that's just such an admirable quality in a politician. Then he moves on to the Civil War in the United States about American slavery. He points out that 6 million white inhabitants in the slave states, less than 350,000 owned slaves, and the South was trying to preserve the Southern rich man's aristocracy of planters. More things that were new to me: 660,000 slaves were owned by ministers of the gospel, Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian ministers owned slaves. He points out that the British abolished West Indian slavery with the Act of 1833, a great reform achieved by the Whig government of Earl Grey. Another surprise was the inclusion of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, all throughout the earlier three, this is the last volume, and the earlier volumes, he just barely mentions any English author. He pretty much omits all of them, maybe just a name here or there. But here he spends almost an entire page on Harriet Beecher Stowe and the significance of her book. And he notes that by 1852, more than 1 million copies had been sold in Britain, more than any other book except the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. He calls Uncle Tom's Cabin a herald of the storm. Once again, the battles of the Civil War. Then he moves back to England and the struggle for home rule in Ireland. This was Gladstone's valiant campaign. It's failed, but it's an example of hopelessly congested politics in Britain. He ends the volume with Queen Victoria. She's the longest running monarch, and it's notable that he barely mentions her. And so it's kind of like, by omitting her, he's kind of criticizing her, and then when he does insert a quote from Queen Victoria, it's a quote from the Boer War in South Africa, where the British lost a battle, and so Queen Victoria's quote is, "Please understand that there is no one depressed in this house. We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist." So this is also in Wikipedia as a notable quote from Queen Victoria. It's a terrible sentence. It's a double negative. I don't even know what she's talking about. Like I said, I'm not an expert at grammar, but when they lost the battle, why didn't she just say, "I'm confident that England will win"? So the book ends with Queen Victoria's death in 1901. So I hope that gives you a general idea of the books. I doubt if I'm going to read any more of his books. He does have power and kind of a presence to his writing. You also get a sense of this ultra aggressive and competitive person. He doesn't have much feel for humanity. But on the other hand, as a leader, to show a lot of compassion can be seen by some critics as weakness. So I'm giving him an excuse for his toughness. Thanks for watching.